Welcome to Whispers of Asia, a channel where forgotten folklore breathes again, through shadows, through silence, through the spaces between prayers and curses. Here, ancient rituals are not dead, they are only waiting. In temples swallowed by vines, in alleys stained with incense and blood, in lullabies that mothers no longer dare to sing, Asia hides stories never meant to be heard. But we listen. We walk where the brave won't. We speak what the elders warn against. We open the door between the living and the haunted, just enough to let the whispers crawl through. Each tale you hear is stitched from truth, dream, and dread. Each echo is a warning. So light a single candle, sit very still, and let the darkness speak first. Because on this channel, we don't tell horror stories, we awaken them. The wind arrived before the man did. It howled across the high ridges of the Tsering Mountains, curling through the hollows of forgotten stone and whispering down paths no map had named. The kind of wind that didn't just move the air, but stirred memory, like something old and unsettled, dragging its long breath through the bones of the earth. Daniel Rowe stood at the edge of a narrow cliff path, his boots dusted in frost and silence. He wasn't dressed for the altitude. The cold had already bitten deep into his fingers, even through thermal gloves. His recorder, an old Marantz wrapped in cloth and reverence, was cradled in his hands like an offering. Behind him, the villagers had stopped following. They had brought him only this far, pointing with gloved hands and cautious eyes toward a direction that no longer had trail markers. One woman, the oldest, had whispered something as she turned away. It wasn't a warning, exactly, more like a surrender. She had pressed a string of dark beads into his hand and closed his fingers around it. The string was broken, its last bead missing. He didn't understand what it meant, but he took it anyway. He took everything now: sounds, symbols, fragments of ritual. He was here to capture what remained of dying chants, sacred harmonies passed from throat to throat across centuries, echoes vanishing into snow. But there was one chant not listed in any archive, a story that emerged only when the fires burned low and the elders believed they were no longer being recorded, a chant that wasn't meant to be sung by the living. They called it the breathless song, not because it was whispered, but because those who learned it eventually stopped breathing altogether. And at the center of it, always, was the drum. A ceremonial drum with no known origin, said to be hidden in the ruins of a monastery so remote even birds did not fly over it. The villagers never spoke its name aloud, only gestures, only unease. They said the drum had a face, not carved, not painted, but stretched, salted, preserved. It was never to be played, never even to be approached, but Daniel had come too far for myths. The world didn't care about old fears. It cared about documentation. It cared about discovery. And in some quieter part of himself, he knew he had come for more than just recording. He wanted to hear it, even once, even if it killed him. The wind surged again, like something had just exhaled behind the mountain ridge. He looked up. The sun was slipping behind the peaks, casting long streaks of red across the snow. Shadows stretched thin across jagged rock, and far in the distance, barely more than a silhouette, he saw what could have been a structure. Not a temple, not a shrine, but a wound in the mountain. The monastery. It didn't rise up with majesty. It sank, as if the earth had swallowed it halfway and then changed its mind. Its roof was caved in, the edges sagged, but something in the angle of the entrance, a half-circle barely visible beneath the snowdrift, pulled at him. As he stepped forward, a strange heaviness pressed against his chest. Not the altitude, not the cold. It felt like silence becoming solid. The air changed. The world quieted too quickly. He heard his own boots crunch, his own breath, and something else. A rhythm. So faint it could have been his pulse, but it wasn't. It was slower, like breath, like lungs beneath soil. He paused. The recorder in his hands remained off. He wanted to wait for the right moment, but even in the stillness, he could almost feel the pressure of sound trying to seep into his skin. As he moved toward the monastery's entrance, he saw the remnants of a gate, charred prayer flags, stone that had been blackened as if fire had once tried to purify what could not be cleansed. Inside, it was colder than outside, but dry. The snow didn't reach in here. The wind died at the threshold, and within that hollow ruin, Daniel felt, for the first time in his life, like he was standing in the echo of a breath that never ended. To his right, a toppled altar. To his left, cracked wall frescoes, all faces scraped out. And in the center, the drum. It sat on a stand made of human femurs, lashed together with sinew. The hide was dark, oily, wrinkled like old parchment, and faintly, so faintly, the impressions of mouths were visible beneath the surface. Some still open, some sealed shut with what looked like black thread. He dropped to one knee, not out of reverence, out of instinct. It felt wrong to stand before it. The rhythm, that ghost of a beat, was now gone. But his ears still felt full. He placed the recorder down, hands trembling, not from cold anymore, from a sensation he couldn't name. He pressed the red button. The light blinked. Silence. Then, a breath. Not his, not wind. A breath recorded from a mouth that was no longer there. He didn't press stop. The doorway swallowed him whole. Daniel stepped into the monastery like stepping into someone else's lungs, where every sound was hushed by something thicker than air. The floor sagged slightly beneath his boots, yet no creak followed. The silence here wasn't empty, it was watchful, like the walls had grown ears and forgotten how to sleep. The scent was strange, not rot, not dust, but a sour, metallic sharpness, like breath that had been held for too long, gone stale in a mouth that could no longer close. His breath fogged before him, forming ghostly shapes that lingered a fraction too long. He switched on the small lantern clipped to his parka, casting a yellow halo that trembled against the carved stone. The carvings weren't sacred. They weren't even legible. They were scratchings, dozens, maybe hundreds of finger-worn gouges. Across the walls, up toward the ceilings, some still faintly stained with what looked like dried blood or ink. Shapes that tried to be symbols but fell short, like someone had tried over and over to remember how to write and failed. The recorder at his side still blinked red. Daniel hadn't stopped it. He hadn't dared to. As he walked deeper, the cold thickened around his knees. The floor sloped downward, the architecture of the place revealing itself in slow fragments. Not a traditional monastery. No Buddha, no shrine, no lanterns or incense holders. Just long, descending halls carved into the rock, like the entire monastery had been designed to go inward, away from the sun. A prison for prayers, a tomb for songs, and everywhere, threads. dangling from the ceilings, tucked into cracks, tied into knots across door frames. Threads of black, red, gold, some slick with time, some frayed, all of them whispering with motion, even when the wind could not possibly reach them. He passed a corridor where the floor had collapsed, revealing what looked like the remnants of robes, dozens of them, buried beneath rock and silence. Some still knotted at the collar, as if their wearers had vanished from within. He whispered, mostly to himself, "Is this all real?" His voice didn't echo. The sound fell from his lips and was gone. Not absorbed, erased. The further he walked, the more the air pressed in. The ceiling dropped lower, the walls narrowed, until finally he reached a door, or what had once been one. A curved archway, blackened at the edges, and beyond it, a chamber. The only room not collapsed. It pulsed with an invisible weight. Not magnetic, not spiritual, something older. He couldn't name it, but his body knew. It made his spine stiffen, made his mouth dry, made his knees lock. And in that chamber, the drum, the same as before, but somehow more alive. Daniel stepped across the threshold, and something changed. Not in the room, not visibly, but in him. His ears began to ring, not high-pitched, but low like thunder under soil. His teeth ached, his breath caught, and his tongue felt heavy. He closed the distance slowly. His lantern revealed every detail of the drum's surface. The skin was not tanned evenly. It was stretched in segments, sections sewn together. And within those patches, beneath the leathery surface, shapes moved. Not truly, but the illusion of motion was there, like something shifting under parchment. He leaned in, closer, and saw it. A mouth, sewn open. The thread woven through its lips wasn't modern. It was ritual thread, the kind used in funerary rites to bind the dead before cremation. But this wasn't for peace. This was punishment. The thread was black and stiff, piercing skin that cracked but did not bleed. And there was something in the way it curled that made him think of a scream that had never ended. He stepped back, too quickly. His boot tapped something. He looked down. Another mouth, smaller, as if from a younger face, also sewn, also silent. But this one had something lodged between the teeth, a shard of bone or maybe ivory, inscribed with characters too faded to read. He crouched, reached for it. As his fingers grazed the shard, the recorder clicked. No one touched it, but the click echoed like it had come from within his own skull. The red light stopped blinking. It was off. He hadn't remembered stopping it. He reached to restart the device, but the buttons wouldn't respond. Not broken, just unresponsive. Like the recorder knew it wasn't supposed to record this. He stood again, and that's when he noticed the walls of the chamber were covered in marks. Rows upon rows of vertical scratches, not carved, scraped, clawed, as if 100 people had tried to claw their way out after the door was already shut. Each line bore a strange curve, a repetition of movement that hinted not at desperation, but rhythm. As if they weren't struggling, they were chanting, but with their fingernails. He turned toward the drum again, and that's when he saw it had moved. Not far, but enough. The stand beneath it had shifted, the dust around it disturbed. His breath froze in his throat. He hadn't heard anything, hadn't felt a tremor, but the drum had turned slightly, facing him, as if ready to listen. He took a step back, then another. The room stayed still, but the rhythm returned. Not from the walls, not from the air, but inside his own chest. A thudding beat, slow, measured, like a drum. No, not like. It was a drum, but it wasn't outside. It was him. His heart was no longer beating for him. It was beating for something else. He stumbled out of the chamber, nearly slipping on the stone. The cold outside the doorway hit him like a wall, but it brought clarity. The rhythm faded slightly. The weight in his ears lessened. He didn't run. He didn't dare. He walked fast, steady, back up the long corridor, passing the knotted threads, the gouged walls, the buried robes. He did not look back. But as he reached the exit, just before crossing into the open snow and the lightless dusk beyond, he heard it. A sound from the depths of the monastery. Not loud, not angry, a whisper, like cloth tearing under water, or the skin of a drum shifting under breath.
Daniel didn't remember walking back to the tent. He remembered the monastery fading behind him, swallowed by snow and distance. He remembered the ache in his legs, the burn in his lungs, the cold air tasting like ash. But not the walk, not the steps, not the journey back down the mountain. Only the silence. It followed him, not as a memory, but as a companion. The villagers had already gone. Their footprints vanished beneath the evening frost. The firewood he'd gathered earlier remained untouched. His gear was still there, sleeping bag, camera, satellite phone, but something felt off, like someone had carefully examined each object and placed it exactly back where it belonged, almost too perfectly. He unzipped the tent and stepped inside. The recorder, still in his coat pocket, had gone completely dead. No lights, no playback, no sound. He placed it beside his cot and stared at it, as if waiting for it to twitch. Instead, something else moved. A flutter, faint, like moth wings from inside his coat. He reached into the inner pocket and pulled out the string of prayer beads the old woman had given him before the ascent. All the beads were still there now. The string was no longer broken. His fingers trembled. He was sure, absolutely sure, it had been missing the final bead. He remembered the way she had pressed it into his hand, whispering something in Tibetan he didn't understand. Now the strand was whole, complete. He didn't know what that meant, but it didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like something had been accepted. He set the beads down beside the recorder and reached for his notebook. He tried to write, tried to transcribe what he saw, but the words refused to form. Every sentence felt like it was being chewed and swallowed before it left his brain. So he drew instead. He had never been good at it, but his hand moved on its own, line by line, curve by curve, until the image revealed itself. The drum. Detailed, exact, almost perfect in its proportions. But what disturbed him wasn't the accuracy. It was the additional element. He had drawn a mouth. Just beneath the surface of the drum skin, a large one, stretched open and stitched tight, like the ones he saw in the chamber, but this one had something inside it. A tongue. Not dry, not dead, drawn mid-movement, as if speaking beneath the skin. He dropped the pen. It rolled across the floor of the tent and settled near the entrance. Outside, the wind howled, but only for a moment. Then it stopped,
as if cut short. The kind of silence that felt listening. Daniel lay back in the cot, wrapping himself in layers. The mountain air had grown even colder. He tried to distract himself, reading, breathing, focusing on the sound of his own heartbeat, but it was no longer steady. It pulsed. Not fast, not irregular, just wrong, like someone else was tapping on his chest from the inside. Eventually, he fell into a half-sleep, and in that place between waking and dream, he heard the chant. Soft, low, not spoken with tongues, but with breath. Like voices beneath earth, singing from below. A rhythm that was not heard, but felt, somewhere between the ribs and the spine. He tried to wake, but his body would not respond. He tried to scream, but his mouth would not move. Instead, he felt it, his lips parting on their own, his jaw slackening, his tongue shaping words he did not know, chanting, repeating, matching a rhythm not of his making. He woke with a start, throat raw, mouth open, breath sharp and shallow. The wind outside was gone, not quiet, gone, as if the mountain had stopped breathing. He stumbled out of the tent, boots crunching against the frozen dirt. The sky was moonless. Only stars, sharp and cold, glittered like the eyes of something ancient watching from above. He turned slowly, scanning the snowbanks, the scattered rocks, the trees below. And there, no more than 10 feet from the edge of the camp, something dark was pressed into the snow. He approached cautiously. It was small, soft, organic. A tongue. Human. Fresh. Still wet. Still twitching. Laid gently on the ground like a ritual offering. Perfectly positioned. Not tossed. Not dropped. Placed. Daniel staggered back. The recorder in his tent turned on. He heard the click. He heard the hum. And then he heard it. The chant. Not from the device, from inside him. He covered his mouth, panic setting in. His breath came in ragged bursts, but the rhythm continued, deep in his chest, in his throat, in his bones. And suddenly, he understood. The drum did not echo your voice. It collected it, bit by bit, breath by breath, until what was you no longer belonged to you. He fell to his knees, snow biting into his palms, the stars spinning above. And in that spinning, he remembered what the villagers had said. Those who heard the chant would lose their voice. Their words would dry up. Their speech would crack. And then they would begin chanting in their sleep, until one night they disappeared. Only their tongues left behind, still singing, still trying to scream.
The next morning came without light. Only a dim grayness seeped over the ridgeline, too thin to be called dawn. The sky was heavy, smeared with mist and ash-colored clouds. The mountain didn't breathe. The snow didn't fall. Everything simply waited. Daniel didn't speak when he woke, not because he chose silence, because he couldn't. His throat felt torn, as if he'd been screaming for hours, though he remembered no dreams, no nightmares, only that pressure in his chest, that persistent rhythm, slow and hollow, like something knocking from beneath his ribs. He tried to hum, just a note, any tone. Nothing came, not even breath, only a dry hiss of air, like dragging wind through cracked stone. He reached for water, swallowing painfully, but it didn't help. His voice wasn't lost. It had been taken. The recorder still sat beside the cot, its red light blinking now, even though it had no power source. He hadn't touched it since last night, yet it glowed, faint and pulsing, in time with something he could not hear, but only feel. He tried turning it off. Nothing happened. He held it in both hands and brought it close to his ear. Silence. Then, a whisper. Not words. Breath. Inhale. Exhale. Repeat. As if the recorder had lungs now. He dropped it. It didn't break. It simply landed, softly, like something too alive to shatter. Outside the tent, the sky was colorless. The world had bled itself dry. Daniel moved slowly, layering his gear, checking his pack with mechanical fingers. His journal was still open to the drawing he had made the night before, the image of the stitched mouth with the tongue curling up from beneath the drum skin. But now, it was different. The ink had bled. The tongue was gone. In its place was a second mouth, smaller, right below the first, also sewn open, also silent. He hadn't drawn that. He was sure. And yet his own handwriting circled it, a single note scribbled in pencil. Every chant adds another mouth. He didn't remember writing that either. He snapped the notebook shut and pushed it deep into his pack. He needed answers, not superstition, not hallucination. He needed to go back. He needed to see the drum again. This time, not as a researcher, but as a witness. The path back to the monastery felt longer, though he had walked it just the day before. The landscape shifted subtly. Rocks he swore he had passed before were gone. The air felt thinner, but heavier somehow, like breathing through water thickened with ash. Halfway up the ridge, the wind returned, but not as it had before. It no longer howled. It chanted. Soft, low, not words he could understand, but syllables that pressed against his skin like hot breath. They crawled inside his ears, curled beneath his eyes, settled behind his teeth. He didn't run. He couldn't. His legs moved at a steady pace, but they no longer felt like his. Each step followed a rhythm. 1, 2, 1, 2, like the beat of a drum he could no longer resist. The monastery came into view again. It looked the same, but it wasn't. Its roof sagged deeper, its walls seemed more cracked, and its doorway wider, as if it had been waiting. He entered without hesitation. The silence inside welcomed him, folding around his body like robes soaked in ice water. He didn't light the lantern. He didn't need to. Somewhere beneath the surface, something glowed, a faint golden flicker pulsing from deep within the stone walls, like veins of dying light buried alive. He moved through the corridor, passing the same gouged markings, the same hanging threads, but now they twitched, only slightly, as if his presence stirred memory into motion. When he reached the chamber, the air grew warmer, not comfortingly so. It was the warmth of breath, the warmth of lungs, and the drum had moved again. Now it sat in the center of the room, no longer on its stand. It leaned slightly, resting on one edge, like it had dragged itself forward. There were more mouths now. He didn't count them. He couldn't.
but he saw them, swelling beneath the skin like bubbles under old parchment. Some were fresh, some were ancient. Some had no lips, only teeth. Some looked as if they had tried to bite their way out. He didn't flinch. Not anymore. Instead, he knelt before it and waited. The chant began slowly, from within him. His lips parted, his tongue moved, his jaw quivered, and the words came. He didn't know the language, didn't recognize the sound, but they poured out of him, slow and deep, matching the pulse in his chest. The drum pulsed in reply, not physically, not visibly, but spiritually, a resonance, a mirror, a connection. And then something strange happened. He understood. Not the words, but the meaning. The chant was not a hymn, it was a recording, a sacred storage of all voices once silenced, each beat a story, each breath a soul, trapped, layered, pressed into the skin like ink into scroll. The monastery was not a place of worship, it was an archive, a vault of voices, and the drum was the key. He felt his body sway, the air shimmered, and for a moment he saw them. The monks, dozens of them standing along the chamber walls, their faces stretched, their mouths stitched open, their eyes black and dry. They did not speak, they sang, and their song echoed through him, through the drum, through the monastery. It wasn't beautiful, it was begging. Each voice trying to scream without lips, trying to escape through rhythm. Daniel opened his eyes. He was alone again. The vision faded, but the chant continued, now outside of him, now all around him. The drum pulsed once more, and he heard a final word, not whispered, not spoken, but given. A name, his own, not as he heard it, but as the drum would remember it, spoken not with love, but with hunger. He stumbled back. The chant stopped. The warmth vanished. The air returned to ice, and the drum rolled slightly forward, as if waiting to be played. He turned and fled, not out of fear, but because he knew, if he stayed, he would not leave with his voice, he would leave within the drum. And the next time the wind howled, it would be him that the villagers heard.
The mountain wind was no longer just wind. It moved like breath, exhaled in rhythm, inhaled with pause. It sighed across stone like lungs behind skin, rising and falling as though the land itself had begun to breathe. Daniel listened, not by choice, by instinct. Even wrapped in his tent, buried in layers of down and wool, he couldn't unhear it. The gusts didn't scream. They murmured, whispering syllables across snowbanks, threading vowels through pine branches, humming consonants through the skeletal remains of long-dead trees. Every gust carried a voice that didn't belong to this world. He had tried leaving, tried descending the path at first light, his pack strapped, his gear stuffed, his legs stiff with panic. But the trail had changed. What was once a clear route back to the village had twisted into a disjointed spiral, as if the mountain had rearranged its ridges overnight, hiding the exit like a spider curling around its prey. Worse still, the snow no longer crunched beneath his boots. It pulsed, softly, in sync with something deeper underground. Every step brought him back
Back to the same ridge, back to the same twisted trees, back to the shadowed outline of the monastery, half devoured by cliffside, yet always visible from the corner of his eye. He had not just seen the drum, he had been heard by it. And once the drum heard you, it remembered. Now the wind knew his breath pattern. Now the snow adjusted to his footsteps. Now the mountain mimicked his body, until he no longer felt certain which movement was truly his. That night, Daniel built a fire, even though the cold didn't bite anymore, even though his skin no longer shivered, his breath no longer fogged, and his pulse no longer quickened. He built it anyway, because he needed to see something real burn. The flames danced unevenly, coughing smoke into the air, and for a while he watched. Then he noticed the smoke didn't rise. It curled downward, into the snow, like breath being drawn through invisible nostrils. Something below was inhaling. He stood up sharply, dizzy. His ears rang. The chant was returning, but this time it didn't come from within him. It came from just beyond the firelight, from the tree line, low, layered, familiar. Each voice echoing with slight delay as if following some unholy conductor. A choir without a leader, a song without end. He backed away. The recorder in his pocket switched on with a static pop. He hadn't touched it. He hadn't powered it in hours. But it blinked, recorded, and played back something impossible. His voice, not chanting, pleading, a broken whisper, recorded from a moment he didn't remember. Don't let it in. Don't open your mouth. Don't. Then static. Then silence. He dropped the recorder. The fire flared once, then died. The wind rose immediately to fill the vacuum, wrapping around him like a cold throat. And then it spoke. Not aloud, not inside his mind, but between both, like a sound riding the edge of thought. It spoke through his own exhale. Each breath he released carried syllables he hadn't shaped, each word unspoken by him, yet formed by his lungs. He clamped his mouth shut, held his breath, but the wind simply mimicked the shape of what he would have said and whispered it back to him. He spun around, eyes wide, searching for movement. None. Only darkness, only wind, and something fluttering at the edge of vision, a thread, black, knotting itself through air. It curled toward him, weaving like silk in reverse, trying to tie itself around his lips. He tore backward, tumbling into the snow, and beneath him, not ground, not snow, but skin, thin, cold, flesh stretched tight over something soft. He rolled away just as the snow split, not cracking like ice, tearing like parchment. Beneath it, a face, mouth sewn open, eyes stitched shut, silent, still, but breathing, breath rising from beneath its skin, from beneath the earth. He scrambled back to his tent and zipped himself inside, not for protection. He knew the fabric meant nothing now, but he needed a barrier, however thin, between him and whatever watched through the folds of air. The drum had not been an artifact. It had been a seed, and now it was growing, not just in the monastery, but in the mountain, and in him. He pressed his hands over his mouth, trying not to scream, not to sob, because every sound he made now was theirs to keep. And when the wind brushed the edge of the tent like fingers grazing cloth, he heard it whisper, "Your voice is a doorway. Let it open." He didn't sleep. He didn't dare. But somewhere in the black hours between night and morning, he blinked too long. And in that moment of near sleep, he dreamed of the drum. Only this time, it had no skin, only mouths. Mouths on all sides, all sewn open, all moving. But there was no sound, no chant, only one slow breath, rising, falling, echoing from within them all. A breath that belonged to him.
Before he came to Tibet, Daniel Rowe believed that listening was a form of reverence. He had studied sound like scripture, not just music, but the silence between notes, the dying fall of a chant, the friction in an unspoken breath. He had traveled across continents in search of vanishing voices, archive after archive, monastery after temple, always respectful, always unseen. He thought that made him safe. He thought that made him separate. But now, listening had become a wound, and something was crawling through it. It had been 2 nights since the fire went out. He hadn't relit it. He no longer needed warmth. His body no longer felt cold or hunger. He ate, but forgot the taste, drank, but never remembered thirst. Even sleep was uncertain now. He closed his eyes, but didn't know if he dreamed or disappeared. The only thing he felt was the chant. It lived behind his eyes now, not a melody, but a memory. Sometimes it rose without warning, a syllable whispered across the back of his teeth. Sometimes it came as breath, exhaled in perfect rhythm with something far beneath the mountain. But most often, it came as pressure, a low hum in his spine, a beat that wasn't his heartbeat, a sound that listened back. He had stopped using the recorder, stopped writing in his journal, stopped trying to capture anything, because he realized the moment he opened his ears, he hadn't been preserving a sacred ritual. He had entered one, and it hadn't ended. It had only waited for someone like him, someone who listened too deeply, who heard not with the ears, but with the soul. Now even the mountain knew his name. He wandered that day, not toward the monastery, but around it, circling the ridges, trying to retrace the old footpaths, hoping one might lead away from this place. But everywhere he walked, the wind followed, not as weather, but as voice. It mimicked his gait. It adjusted to his breath. It filled his silence with something almost kind, almost welcoming. That was the worst part. It no longer felt like he was being hunted. It felt like he was being invited. At noon, he found an outcrop of prayer stones, piled high in circular mounds, ancient, weathered, etched with symbols too faded to read. But something strange caught his eye. The topmost stones had no script, only mouths, drawn with charcoal, carved with knives, burned with ritual ash, all open, all silent, all identical. He knelt, touched one, and heard his own voice whisper from the back of his throat. The drum remembers. He staggered back. The chant rose immediately. The wind curved inward, and he knew without looking that someone stood behind him. He didn't turn. He didn't have to. He felt it. Not a presence, not a shadow, a reflection. Like someone made of his own voice, stitched together from every breath he had given in the last week. It didn't speak. It only stood there, until the wind changed, until the rhythm passed, and he was alone again. He walked back to camp as the sun dipped behind the peaks, but even the light looked wrong now. Pale, thin, like it struggled to touch anything. That night, he heard scratching at the walls of his tent. Not claws, not branches, fingertips, tracing the fabric slowly, testing it, as if seeking the seam between inside and out. He didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't speak. Because deep down, he knew, if he made a sound, even a gasp, it would be used, it would be recorded, and it would join. Later, in the hollow quiet of sleepless hours, he thought about the monks, the ones whose faces were taken, the ones who refused to chant at death. They had believed silence was power. They had believed they could defy the right by keeping their voices inside. But the ritual had other plans. Their faces were flayed, their mouths sewn open, their silence stretched and salted, so that even in death, they would speak, not by choice, but by drumbeat. And now Daniel understood the truth. Silence wasn't defiance, it was currency, and the drum was rich. The next morning he no longer tried to speak. There was no voice left, only echoes, only rhythm, only a hollow in his chest where sound used to live. He took one final look at the recorder. Its red light blinked once, then off, then on again. But this time, not red, white, like an eye opening, watching, recording, breathing. And in the reflection of its plastic casing, he saw his own mouth, not moving, but slowly parting. A single thread curling across his lip like smoke, the beginning of a stitch.
That night did not arrive like the ones before it. It did not fall gently across the mountain. It did not paint the snow blue or kiss the stones with shadow. It simply was. A sudden darkening, a breath held too long, a silence that dropped like a veil, thick and complete. Daniel sat inside his tent, unmoving, not from fear, but from knowing. The time for fear had passed. There was nothing left in him to scream, nothing left to resist. Only this, the moment all things go still, not in peace, but in preparation. He hadn't spoken in 2 days, not a word, not even a whisper, and yet he could feel the chant growing louder inside him. It no longer needed sound. It fed on shape, the way his mouth curved in sleep, the rhythm of his breath, the flutter in his chest that used to be a heartbeat, now simply the echo of something beneath the earth. The first stitch had appeared that morning, just above his lip, tucked along the corner where no mirror could easily show. Thin, black, nearly invisible. But when he touched it, it pulsed, alive. He hadn't put it there, but he hadn't tried to remove it either. There was no pain, no blood, only belonging. Outside, the wind didn't blow. It watched. The trees didn't creak. They waited. And the sky above didn't glitter with stars. It hung blank, a canvas that had forgotten color. He opened the tent flap slowly. There was no snow, no cold, no sound. Even his own footsteps didn't crunch. The earth had gone soft, as if everything was now covered in skin, stretched tight, pulsing quietly beneath his boots. The monastery called to him, not with voice, with rhythm. It beat once, a pulse behind his ears, then again in the space between thoughts, then again in his teeth, his spine, his bones. It was not an invitation, it was a summons. He walked, not with urgency, but with knowing. The path no longer twisted, it opened. Everything made room for him now. The wind stepped aside, the trees leaned away. Even the rocks seemed to flatten beneath his feet, as if the mountain was preparing for something sacred or something final. When he reached the monastery, the entrance no longer looked ruined. It had changed. The stone was darker, smoother, breathing, as if the building itself had healed. Inside, no torch was needed. The chamber glowed with a soft golden hum, not light exactly, but memory, a warmth that wasn't warm, a shimmer that didn't illuminate, but simply allowed. And in the center of the chamber, the drum, now fully awake, it sat upright, no longer tilted, no longer passive. The stand beneath it had fused into its base, now shaped from polished bone. The mouths beneath the skin had multiplied, too many to count, some wide with laughter, some broken with grief, some not human at all silent, but moving. Daniel stepped toward it, breath slow, eyes unfocused. The chant returned, not aloud, not heard, but felt. He no longer resisted. His lips parted, not to speak, to surrender. The second stitch formed as he exhaled, thin, black, elegant. He did not touch it. He did not flinch. Behind him, the walls of the monastery trembled. A single gust of air rolled through the corridor, warm and wet, like breath from a massive lung. And then the monks appeared, not as spirits, but as memory. They stepped from the stone, their robes torn, their faces skinless, their mouths sewn into eternal expression. Each stood perfectly still, heads bowed, their backs to the drum, as if guarding it, as if warning. But Daniel understood the truth. They were not warning him away. They were welcoming him in. The drum pulsed again. This time the sound was real, audible, one low, thudding beat that cracked through the chamber like thunder in a sealed room. Daniel fell to his knees, not in pain, in obedience. The chant rose again, but now from within the walls, from the stone, from the beams, from the wind, from the hollow air that once was his voice. He placed his palms on the ground. It was no longer cold. It was warm, alive, beating. And when he leaned forward, just slightly, his forehead touched the floor, and he heard it clearly for the first time. The voice beneath the drum. Not words, just breath. Endless breath, layered with pain, layered with longing, layered with voices that once begged for silence and now prayed to be heard. The third stitch formed. This one he felt, a thread pulled across his lower lip, cinching the corners just slightly. Not shut, not yet. but almost. He stood again, faced the drum, and whispered without sound, "I understand now." The wind outside rose in answer, not a howl, a harmony. The night accepted his silence, and for the first time, so did he.
The next morning never came. The sky remained the same colorless smear it had been all night, neither light nor dark, suspended in some liminal space where time forgot to pass. Daniel stood just outside the monastery entrance, unmoving, breathing quietly through a mouth that was no longer entirely his. 3 stitches now, threaded neatly across the corners of his lips, tight enough to restrict, loose enough to allow small sounds to slip through. But he hadn't spoken in hours, hadn't tried. The need was gone. Every word he might have uttered was already echoing somewhere beneath the surface of this mountain, each syllable absorbed, translated, and stored. The monastery had taken his voice, but it had given him something else. He could feel the drum now, not just see it, not just hear it, feel it, humming at the edge of his spine, resonating beneath his ribs, pulsing in his teeth like marrow made of rhythm. He stepped back inside, not with hesitation, with certainty. The monks were still there, lining the chamber walls, more defined now, more solid as though the silence had fed them. Their robes moved without wind, their stitched mouths trembled slightly, quivering like a memory trying to speak again. And in the center, the drum, no longer still. Its surface quivered. The skin moved, rippling like water struck by a distant vibration. The mouths beneath it shifted, slowly, unnaturally, lips curling as if reacting to sound that hadn't yet arrived. Watched. He did not blink. One mouth in the center bulged upward, rising against the hide like a fist beneath fabric. Then it opened. The stitch holding it shut unraveled on its own, curling like black threads soaked in breath. The mouth yawned wide, trembling, lips cracked and dry. And then it spoke. Not with sound, with memory. Images flooded Daniel's mind, not visions, not dreams, but sensations, a lifetime condensed into a breath. He saw a young monk, nameless, voiceless, kneeling beside the drum centuries ago. He saw the ritual, the refusal, the punishment, the flaying. He felt the needle pass through his own lips. He felt the salt burn across his face, and then he became the mouth. For one long second, Daniel was the memory. He inhaled sharply and stumbled backward. The chant rose with him, spiraling through the room like smoke. The other mouths began to twitch, not all at once, but in slow sequence, like eyes blinking awake after centuries of sleep. One by one, the stitches loosened, not torn, released. Each thread pulled gently by invisible hands, each mouth gasping silently as though returning to a breath they had not taken in hundreds of years. They did not speak. They moved. Some laughed, some grimaced, some looked as if they were sobbing, but no tears came, only breath. Daniel felt it pass over him, dozens of invisible exhalations, dry and ancient, as if he were standing at the center of 1,000 dying prayers. He dropped to his knees again, not out of worship, but instinct, because something inside him wanted to answer. The 4th stitch formed. This time it crossed from lip to lip, the beginning of closure. He felt it tighten as he exhaled,
felt it throb when he resisted, and he knew the next sound he made would not be his own. So he said nothing. He closed his eyes and waited. A single thread dropped from the ceiling, thin, black, alive. It floated gently, curling through the air like it was seeking a home. It found his face, danced along his cheek, slid across his mouth, and pulled gently at the corners. He did not resist. The monks did not move, but the mouths on the drum continued, opening, closing, shaping memories into breath. One mouth near the bottom curled back in what looked like a scream, but its expression held something deeper. Gratitude, a surrender, a final offering. The monks had not been trapped. They had been preserved. The drum was not punishment. It was a prison built to hold voices that would otherwise vanish, not to torment them, to protect them. But Daniel could feel the balance shifting now. Too many mouths, too many voices. The vessel was full, and it was looking for a new one. His lips twitched. He felt the rhythm rise again, this time from deep inside his chest. His lungs moved in sync, his throat pulsed, his tongue coiled, ready to form syllables he didn't know. But then, something else happened. One of the monks turned, only slightly, a tilt of the head, a flicker of movement. It shouldn't have been possible. They had always faced away from the drum, guardians, witnesses, but this one now watched him. Its sewn mouth quivered. And then Daniel heard something, not from outside, from inside his skull. A voice, familiar, dry, his own, but older. If you speak, you stay. Daniel's jaw tightened, his heart pounded. The mouth at the center of the drum opened again, wider now, revealing not just teeth, but a tongue. His tongue, the one he had found on the snow days ago. Still twitching, still waiting, still connected. A part of him already offered, already remembered. He turned away. The drum pulsed again. The wind rose inside the chamber. The mouths began to move faster, convulsing in a silent rhythm that grew sharper, tighter, a crescendo made of breath and memory. He stumbled toward the exit, each step heavier than the last. The monks didn't stop him, but their presence thickened around him, their silence pressing against his skin like cloth soaked in sound. He reached the corridor, fell once, got up. The chant followed, not angry, not begging, just insistent. Stay, speak, become. But he kept walking, out of the monastery, into the breathless mountain. The sky had not changed. The wind no longer stirred. But Daniel did not speak. He stitched his silence into the rhythm of his steps. And behind him, the mouths began to close again, one by one, until only the faintest breath remained. Daniel didn't remember walking back to camp. He remembered the sky, still pale and wrong, like frost spread across bruised glass. He remembered the rhythm in his chest, slower now, but deeper, echoing like footsteps down an endless stairwell inside him. He remembered silence curling around his shoulders like a shawl soaked in breath. But no path, no motion, just arrival. The tent stood where he had left it, half sunk into the earth, its edges weighed down by frost that no longer melted, no matter how much the air warmed. The rocks nearby had shifted slightly, now arranged in a perfect circle. He hadn't placed them. Inside the tent, his journal lay open. The pages were full, but not with his handwriting. No pen had touched them, no ink, no pressure. Just lines, dozens of them, tightly drawn, side by side, curved, symmetrical, impossible to decipher. At first, they looked like symbols, then like mouths, then like something in between, a language trying to become flesh. He closed the journal slowly. It pulsed once, softly, as if breathing beneath the cover. He pushed it aside. In his chest, the chant began again, low, persistent. He hadn't spoken in days. He hadn't even opened his mouth. But the chant was forming anyway, not outside him, not inside him, but through him. His breath carried it. Each exhale shaped it. Each heartbeat fed it. It was no longer a sound. It was a condition. It moved like hunger, like warmth, like memory. And yet, he still didn't know the words. That was what disturbed him most. He was chanting, but he had never learned the chant. There had been no teacher, no verse, no repetition. The chant had always been, and now it remembered him. He stepped out of the tent and walked to the cliffside, the one that overlooked the winding trails that once led to the village. Not that it mattered anymore. The trails had vanished, or perhaps he had. Either way, there was no return. The wind brushed his cheek, soft, almost kind, but he knew better. It was measuring him, not as prey, as a vessel. He sat down on a stone, closed his eyes, listened, not with ears, with bone. The rhythm came quickly, a pulse beneath the ground, a breath behind the clouds, a murmur between snowflakes, and beneath it all, the chant. Not sung, spoken without sound. A chorus of unspoken words, as if thousands of mouths were moving in perfect silence, each one reciting a script burned into the back of the wind. He joined them, not aloud, not with lips, but with will. His body became a tuning fork, his breath a metronome. The chant used him like a reed, like a hollowed bone made for resonance, and in that moment he saw. Not with eyes, with memory, not his own. Memories from another lifetime, and another, and another. Monks in darkened halls, villagers in trance, children born during eclipse already humming the rhythm, men vanishing into mountains, never to return, but always leaving behind a tongue. He saw women who heard the chant through childbirth, old men who wept without reason at sunset, all of them connected, not by faith, by sound. But this sound had no origin. It was not created. It was remembered, carried, sustained. It passed from voice to voice like a plague, disguised as prayer. And when a voice resisted, when a throat closed in defiance, the chant didn't die. It shifted. It hollowed the body, turned it inside out, preserved the mouth, removed the rest, salted the silence into skin, and stretched it across the frame of the drum. A drum that wasn't built, but fed. Daniel opened his eyes. The landscape hadn't changed, but he had. He touched his lips. 4 stitches now. The newest one vertical, descending from the center of his upper lip like a black tear frozen in place. His mouth was almost shut, and yet he could still chant. The thread didn't stop the sound, because the sound didn't need a mouth anymore. It had roots. It grew from within. He stood slowly, felt the mountain beneath his feet. It accepted him now. Not fully, not yet, but enough. He walked again, not to the monastery, not to the tent, but nowhere. He wandered, letting the chant guide his steps, letting the wind shape his spine, letting the breath of buried mouths become his shadow. At the edge of a shallow ravine, he stopped. There in the center stood a stone pillar, waist high, worn smooth by time. Wrapped around it, thread, black, tight, sewn through the pillar itself as if it had once been flesh. Atop it, a single object, a tongue, small, dry, cracked. But when the wind touched it, it twitched. Just once. Daniel reached out, and the moment his fingers brushed the stone, the chant stopped. Everything went silent, utterly, impossibly silent. Even his heartbeat paused. Even the mountain held its breath. Then, from behind him, a voice. A single syllable. Not his. Not human. It was the chant condensed into one sound. A name. A command. He turned. No one there. Only the wind. Only the pillar. Only the tongue now curled into the shape of a scream. The chant returned. Like a wave. It knocked him to his knees. He screamed, or tried to, but the stitches held. The scream never reached his throat. It echoed only inside his skull, and then dissolved into song. The chant had changed. It had learned his voice. It no longer needed his permission. It no longer needed his body. It had begun to echo without echo, to sing without singer, to speak without mouth. And Daniel Rowe, the scholar who once came seeking sound, was becoming sound itself. The tongue would not stop moving. It lay still upon the stone pillar, lifeless in shape, darkened by time. But every few seconds, it twitched. Not like a muscle, like a memory, trying to remember what it once was. Daniel stood motionless, his lips nearly shut by thread, breath shallow, chest tight. He didn't dare touch it again. But he didn't walk away either, because in the back of his throat he felt the same twitch, a mirrored motion, as if his tongue, still hidden behind stitched lips, was trying to speak in unison with the one on the pillar. It wasn't just a symbol. It wasn't just a warning. It was his. The one he'd seen in the snow. The one he'd buried. The one he thought he had left behind. And yet, here it was, still moving, still remembering, still waiting. The wind moved differently now. It didn't whisper, it read. It passed over the tongue gently, as though scanning it for syllables, phrases, pieces of a chant it hadn't finished collecting. Daniel turned slightly, scanning the sky, the ground, the trees that bent and held their breath. Everything felt poised, balanced, suspended at a point just before collapse, and he realized this moment was a threshold, not physical, but spiritual, the final space between being a listener and becoming an echo. He knelt slowly, the thread around his mouth tightened with the motion, as if sensing hesitation, as if preparing to close. He ignored it and focused on the tongue. It pulsed once, visibly, a ripple across its dried flesh, and he heard something, not aloud, not in his ears, but in the bones of his jaw. A sound that wasn't voice, a memory that wasn't his, a whisper carried not through air, but through existence. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness he stood in a different place, a hallway of stone, tall, narrow, endless, its walls stitched with mouths, some mooning, some chanting, some muttering in languages that had never been spoken aloud. The floor beneath him pulsed with breath, the ceiling dripped silence, and ahead, at the end of the hall, a door. No handle, no hinges, just a veil of skin stretched tight like the head of a drum. His tongue burned. Inside his real body, back in the cold mountain air, he fell forward onto his hands. The pressure in his throat was rising, not pain, but pressure, as though the chant were inflating inside him, like smoke looking for a crack. His mouth remained closed, but the sound pushed harder, not to escape, to reach. The tongue on the pillar twitched again, this time curling slightly, as though turning toward him. It knew. It recognized. Daniel opened his mouth, only slightly, just enough to exhale, to offer breath, and in that breath the chant returned, not in full voice, but in rhythm, a vibration in the back of his throat, a sigh with syllables. The stitches held, but something got through. The wind surged, the trees groaned, and behind him the earth opened, not with a crack, with a pulse, a rhythmic opening like the skin of the world parting along a breath. From that opening something stepped forward, not a creature, not a shadow, a presence, shaped like silence, coated in breath, moving with the slow rhythm of sleepwalkers and saints. Daniel did not turn. He could not. Instead, he felt its breath beside him, dry, warm, familiar. And then it spoke, with his voice, not the one he had now, the one he had before, the voice that once asked questions, the voice that once recorded stories, the voice that once said, "I want to understand." And the presence repeated it, word for word. "I want to understand." But this time it sounded like a prayer and like a curse. Daniel opened his eyes. He was back on the mountain. The tongue still lay on the pillar, motionless now, but his own lips had parted, and the final stitch, the fifth one, had not yet closed them, not completely, not yet. He rose slowly, breath uneven, body shaking beneath a rhythm that would not stop. He took the tongue in his hand. It was warm. It should not have been warm. He turned and faced the monastery far behind him, glowing faintly at the base of the mountain's throat. He walked, one step at a time, each footfall matched to the chant, each breath timed to the silent rhythm of the mouths below. The wind did not resist, the ground did not shift. He was no longer a trespasser. He was part of the landscape. And as he crossed the threshold of the monastery one final time, he left the tongue at the entrance, gently, ritually, like a gift laid at a door he was now ready to enter. The mouth was almost sealed, the voice was almost gone, but the echo was just beginning. The drum was waiting. It didn't throb, it didn't pulse, it simply existed, quiet, still, and utterly aware. Daniel stood in the threshold of the monastery's deepest chamber, eyes fixed on the thing that had once been just a myth, now a mirror. The monks lined the walls again, but they no longer looked like shadows. They were clear now, present. Their stitched faces glistened as if freshly sealed. Their eyes, once empty, glowed faintly from behind flesh, not with life, but with rhythm. The chant filled the space, not with sound, with intention. It shaped the room. It moved through stone and silence the way fingers move over strings, not to make music, but to remember it. Daniel stepped forward. The final stitch across his lips tightened, now tugging at the corners of his mouth like reins on a beast too close to freedom. But he didn't resist. He was too close now, too deep, too hollow. The closer he came to the drum, the more he felt his body stop being his. His breath no longer came from his lungs. It came from somewhere below, somewhere beneath the floor, beneath the earth, beneath the veil of flesh stretched over all things. The drum breathed for him now. Each inhale, memory. Each exhale, surrender. He reached it, this thing made of salted silence and sown flesh. He did not touch it. He knew better, because the drum had already begun to touch him. It vibrated at a frequency only his bones could feel. His ribs hummed. His teeth ached. His spine tingled with a rhythm that had no origin and no end. And then it played him. There was no movement, no strike, no sound, but inside his chest, a thud, then another, then a pattern. He gasped, and the fifth stitch nearly closed. His knees buckled, his head dropped forward, and in the pit of his stomach, he felt it, the beat. But it wasn't his heart. It was the drum, using him like parchment, a stretched, breathing skin made not to speak, but to echo. He collapsed to his knees, hands trembling. The monks did not move, but their mouths did, every one of them. Still stitched, still shut, but now quivering, not with resistance, but with music. They were playing him too, not with touch, with memory. He felt them reach into him, not physically, but spiritually, and pull up sounds he didn't remember making. Breaths he thought had long vanished, words he had whispered as a child, cries he had buried, gasps he had silenced. He pulled it all to the surface, and the drum played it back, not through its own skin, through his. His lips parted just enough, a sliver of breath escaped, and from that breath came a sound, low, ancient, impossible. It was not his voice. It was a voice that used his body to return, a voice layered in centuries, stacked in grief, salted with ritual. And now It sang, not in melody, in memory. The chamber trembled. Dust curled upward in spirals, caught in invisible currents of rhythm. The wind outside the monastery changed direction, and somewhere deep below, the mountain responded, not with an earthquake, not with collapse, but with a breath. Daniel rose. His hands were no longer shaking. His eyes no longer blinked. His lips no longer bled. He stood before the drum, no longer a scholar, no longer a seeker. He was an instrument, a vessel made of silence, a throat molded by time. And the drum, that sacred, cursed relic, used him with terrifying ease. Every breath he took triggered a pulse of sound in the walls. Every blink sent tremors into the stone. Every thought he had was recorded. He felt it etching his memories onto the invisible thread that wound through this place, a thread that connected every monk, every tongue, every stitch. He was being transcribed, word by word, breath by breath. And then he felt the thread enter him. Not through his skin, through his voice. A thin line of vibration sliding up his throat, curling behind his teeth, pulling at the back of his mouth like a hook. It wanted to tie him shut, not in punishment, in preservation. But Daniel hesitated, just once. A flicker of thought, a memory not yet surrendered. His mother's voice, a phrase, spoken on a rainy morning when he was 8. You don't always have to listen to understand. The chant skipped, only briefly. The rhythm faltered, and in that tiny, imperceptible space, Daniel moved, not far, just one step backward. The drum shuddered, only slightly. The walls responded with a low moan. The monks' mouths fell still, and the thread loosened only slightly, as if the drum was waiting, was testing, was asking, "Will you be mine?" Daniel did not answer. He couldn't. But the breath he held was the only resistance he had left. And in that breath, the chant paused. The chamber no longer felt like a room. It was breathing. It inhaled through the walls, exhaled through the floor. The silence within it had shape now, thick, warm, and rhythmic. Daniel stood in the center. He did not move. He did not speak, but everything around him responded. The drum pulsed once every few seconds, as if marking time not by seconds, but by surrender. With each beat, something in the room shifted, almost imperceptibly. A breath, a ripple, a vibration just below awareness. The monks had stepped forward now, not with feet, with presence. They surrounded the drum in a wide circle, their forms still blurred at the edges, like smoke remembering how to become flesh. Their mouths remained stitched, but their heads were tilted back, as if offering their silence to something larger than themselves. Daniel understood. This was the ritual, not a performance, a continuation, a ceremony that had begun centuries ago and never ended. Each monk who entered this room did not leave it. They became it. Their silence fed it. Their breath sustained it. Their memory filled the spaces where sound could not go. And now it was his turn. He closed his eyes, felt the rhythm return, not in his body, but in the world. The mountain beat like a drum. The monastery exhaled like a throat. The wind coiled like a breath waiting to be spoken. The fifth stitch on his lips began to tighten, slowly, gently, like fingers lacing shut the final seam of a sacred text. He did not resist, not anymore, because he could feel what came next, the echo. It wasn't a sound, it was a becoming, an echo that shaped the flesh around it, a kind of memory that rewrote the self from within. He would not disappear, he would resound. One monk stepped closer. His face was indistinct, his hands folded in prayer. Around his wrists, the ritual threads, red, gold, black, trailed like veins outside the body. He held something in his palms, a needle, bone, worn smooth by centuries of breath. He raised it, not toward Daniel's body, but toward his voice. He felt it, the puncture, not in skin, in memory. The thread followed, pulled through the space between words, threading each breath together with the next until even silence had a spine. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from reverence. He had thought the ritual would take something from him. Instead, it was binding him to something greater. He saw now the monks had not been punished, they had been preserved. Each stitch was a vow, each thread a lifeline. They had not resisted the chant, they had become its guardians. And now, so would he. The needle passed through another breath, the thread tightened, the fifth stitch closed. His mouth was sealed, but his voice had never been louder. It echoed through the chamber, not in sound, but in shape, a vibration that touched each wall, each stone, each memory hanging in the air. And the drum answered. It didn't need to be struck. It responded like a heart, a beat behind a breath, pulsing only when needed. A second monk stepped forward. This one carried something small, a bowl carved from petrified bone, filled with salt-black ash. He knelt, reached forward, and gently pressed 2 fingers into the center of Daniel's forehead. A smear, cold, electric. The moment it touched his skin, his memories rippled outward, not lost, but echoed, passed into the space, offered, etched. The monastery accepted them, and in return, it showed him everything. He saw the first chant ever sung, not with voice, with fire. A circle of monks in darkness, their mouths shut, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling as the wind sang through them. He saw the first stitching, a sacrifice, voluntary, a choice made not in pain, but in trust, to keep the chant alive. He saw the drum created, not built, but fed, each skin stretched with care, each thread tied with ritual, each beat earned. He saw himself, not as he was, as he would become. A figure seated in stillness, eyes closed, mouth sealed, but beneath the silence, everything moved. He opened his eyes. The monks had stepped back. The dim dimmed. The chant settled like dust across old stone. And the drum, that sacred hollow vessel, leaned toward him slightly, as if bowing. Daniel bowed in return, and in that moment, he was no longer Daniel. He was not a scholar, not a man, not even a memory. He was echo, and the ritual was complete.
He no longer felt hunger. He no longer felt cold. He no longer remembered his last name. But the chant remembered him, and that was enough. Daniel sat where the other monks once sat, or where they still sat, depending on how time moved here. Time no longer obeyed the sun, it obeyed the drum. Each beat a season, each breath a century, each silence an eternity folded into the sound between two echoes. His body had stopped resisting days ago, or perhaps it had only just begun. The fifth stitch was now part of him, not thread through flesh, but language through skin. His lips were sealed, but his voice flowed endlessly, folding itself into the rhythm beneath the monastery floor. He hadn't moved in hours, or maybe weeks, but movement was no longer defined by muscle. He had become stillness in motion, a living resonance, a vessel made of silence, a memory racked in breath. Then came the hollowing. It began in his chest, a soft pressure, not pain, not fear, just absence, opening like a blossom behind his ribs. He felt his breath pull deeper, not into lungs, but into space, a space that should not have existed, a cavity being shaped. His heartbeat slowed, not in weakness, in surrender. The drum was making room, not for more sound, but for others. He didn't panic. The fear had been worn away days ago, smoothed out like stone under ritual fingers. He accepted the space. The emptiness behind his ribs widened, then deepened. He felt the echo of every monk before him begin to move inside him, not invading, but returning. He had become an archive, a hollow, a holy instrument. The breath of the first monk passed through his spine. The silence of the second filled the gaps behind his eyes. The sorrow of the third settled into the pit of his belly. He took them in, one by one, not carrying them, holding them, preserving them. He was not alone now. His body had become a room, his voice a corridor, his silence a scripture, and the drum began to fade, not in sound, in need. It pulsed less now, it trembled less often. It had found what it was looking for, a replacement, or perhaps a replica. Daniel understood. He was no longer there to record the drum. He was the drum, a living instrument, a breathing archive, a stitched mouth guarding endless voices. The monks did not look at him, but they felt him, and one by one they began to bow, not to a man, but to a rhythm, to a vessel, to the new echo that now held what the skin of the original drum could no longer contain. Daniel did not weep. He could not. His eyes were dry, his mouth was shut, his breath belonged to others. But somewhere deep inside the new hollow of his chest, he smiled, because now he understood. The chant had never been meant for listeners. It had always been meant for keepers, and every keeper had to be hollow, to hold silence, to echo memory, to speak without speaking. Outside, the mountain trembled just once. A shift, a final adjustment, as though it too was recognizing the change. The wind did not stir. The snow did not fall. Everything was listening, even the earth, especially the earth. The monastery seemed to breathe slower now, less urgently, less desperately, as if the ritual, long interrupted, had finally found completion.
Daniel bowed. It was not a gesture. It was a closing, a punctuation mark at the end of the chant he no longer needed to remember, because now it remembered through him. And with that breath, the hollowing was complete. He no longer needed his voice, because now he was the voice. No one came looking for him, not the villagers, not the university, not the world he left behind. And in time, even the mountain stopped asking questions. Daniel Rowe's tent remained where he had pitched it, weather-worn, bowed under snow, surrounded by a silence too heavy to lift. Inside, everything was untouched. The recorder still blinking, the journal, pages full of symbols no hand had written, his coat folded neatly on the cot, empty. But Daniel was not gone. He had simply changed forms. High in the heart of the monastery, beneath the gaze of monks who no longer needed names, the air pulsed with a rhythm so faint it could only be felt in the bones of the stone. The drum was still there, but it was no longer the source. It had passed on what it held, given itself, let go. Now it rested in shadow, quiet, cracked, its surface dulled from centuries of breath. And in its place, Daniel knelt, still, eyes closed, mouth sealed, back straight, breathing not for himself, but for them. The echoes passed through him now, one after another, a slow, seamless current of memory and meaning. He was the archive, the resonance, the space between chant and silence, and the monks knew it. They did not speak, they did not need to. Their breath moved in time with his. Their stillness fed his stillness. Their silence shaped his silence. Outside, the seasons no longer mattered. Snow came and went, wind rose and fell, but the mountain remained the same, taller now somehow, heavier, like it had grown inwards, like something vast and ancient had finally found its place within it. Far below, in the villages that still lit candles at dusk, people sometimes paused at the edge of sleep. Their lips would part, ever so slightly, their breath would change, and for a brief moment, no more than a blink, they would feel it, a soundless chant, a rhythm not their own, a voice they had never heard but somehow remembered. Then it would fade, and they would forget. But something deep within them would not, because the chant was not gone. It had simply returned to stillness. It lived now in stone, in frost, in breath, in Daniel. And he, no longer a man, no longer a scholar, sat within that echo, eternal, unmoving, unchanged. Each breath he took was a story. Each silence he held was a scripture. Each stitch across his lips was a vow kept perfectly. And when the drum beat one last time, soft, hollow, final, it did not call for more. It bowed, and then it rested. The wind no longer sang, the mouths no longer moved, and the monastery, full at last, sealed itself in quiet, because there was nothing left to echo, nothing left to speak, only the stillness, only the silence, and the keeper who would never leave.